So we have some good memories of him. John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham also believed that happiness was the standard of measurement for what's right and wrong. Happiness should be the standard of measurement. And so rather than rule of law or even natural law, they thought what makes you happy is what should be determined as right and wrong. And because they were pro-democracy, they believed that the majority rule should then determine what constitutes happiness. And they believed in welfare utilitarianism, which meant once the majority rule determines what constitutes happiness, right, because it's not morality or a value system or a belief in God or even natural law, right, once we decide what makes us happy, the government should be the one to regulate it and dole it out so that everyone gets a share. So this idea with utilitarians really kind of brought around the idea in Europe that, hey, reform is a good thing. Let's start looking at our institutions and reforming them. And there was even debate about reforming the US Constitution in its new infancy. You know, is it right? Is it the right thing? Should it be reformed? You know, it was really debates, but it was a discussion. And because John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham believed in democracy, it made reform respectable. Okay, so it opened the door. Henry George and the physiocrats were also influential to the Fabians because they believed that, hey, you know what? People can legitimately own something that they create. But things like air, water, energy, and land cannot be owned by any human being because these are things that are just part of the world that God gave us. And so therefore the government should monitor all of those things and make sure that we all have an equal share. So no one therefore should be able to own any of these things. And that was a big influence on the Fabians. They also borrowed from the gradualists. This is Sir Edmund Burke. I don't know if anybody remembers this guy. He's the one that has this famous quote here, all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing. All right, that was very insightful. But Edmund Burke also believed this. Fundamental changes to the government should be implemented discreetly over time. Because he knew that if you want to make radical changes, if you do it too quickly, you will shock the system. That's how he described it. Therefore, you have to implement changes very slowly, sometimes even introducing a parallel system for a while, making that system feed off of the other one before you eliminate the original system. And we're going to see that that exactly happens later. So the Fabians were looking at all this, and they created another logo besides their wolf in sheep's clothing called the Fabian tortoise. And I don't know if anyone's ever seen it, but it's a cartoon of a tortoise, and he's holding up his front, what would that be, paw? Arm, foot? I don't know, you know what? You can offer me $1 million right now, and I would not know the correct term for that. What is a turtle's
Leg.
foot? Okay, we're going with foot, okay. So he's holding up his right foot, and he's saying, when I strike hard. Right? And he looks very angry. He's an angry tortoise. And of course, the idea that the Fabians had is, you know what? We understand what they're talking about there. We need to have a slow, deliberate, long march toward our goal of a one-world state. We need to have a patient strategy. But when we get there, it will be complete and utter. Right? Just like the Fabian tortoise. Darwinism lent a hand because Darwin was popular at the time, right? And his theory of evolution was getting a lot of interest. People were talking about it in the salons and parlors of their homes. And what this did with pop culture of the day is it got people used to the idea that everything evolves over time. And that those things, those changes take time. They take a long time. So this was just another part of the narrative that helped support what the Fabians were going to try to put together and push. Same with the utopians. The utopians were the pop culture of the day, right? They were the ones, like I said, with H.G. Wells and Upton Sinclair and a couple other guys who were high profile. They were the painters, the sculptors, the playwrights, and the short story and literature authors who were painting idyllic scenes of how wonderful a world, a utopian society would be, where there's no ownership of anything and we all have all of our needs met, right? So they were really romanticizing utopian ideas, and that of course helped push the idea that the Fabians had. Lastly and not least, Marxism. There's our buddy, Karl Marx. Yeah, that beard never caught on. I don't know why. All right, but anyway, we got the two-tone thing going on there. But Karl Marx, of course, we know what he wanted, right? He also wanted a one-world state. He wanted a communist state. But he had a different way of getting there. He thought, look, the workers of the world are going to unite, right? They're going to rise up against capitalism, against any notions of freedom because they're oppressed, and they're going to be so disgusted by it that they're going to demand that their leadership and their governments are toppled over. They're going to cross over state lines and country lines, and they're going to come together and unite. Right? So this is Marx's vision.
Karl Marx believed that you would have a rebellion by the workers against the capitalist system, which would then create a Marxist communist society where you would have dictatorship of the proletariat.
All right, so dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, the Fabians, in essence then, were very good at taking all of these philosophies and bringing them together in order to set their vision and their path towards a one-world state where they would nationalize the economy over time in Europe, and it would be presided over by a cultural and intellectual elite ruling class that is governing the proletariat, right? In essence, all of us dummies in here, right? So that was the plan. And as I said, Karl Marx kind of had a similar vision of where he wanted to go. There were some things that were compatible about the Fabians and the communists, but they both had different ways of getting there. The problem for both of them was people weren't really responding. Okay, the workers of the world did not unite and rise up today. They didn't do that. As a matter of fact, when World War II came, or World War I, they marched off in solidarity with their respective nations and defended their country. And that wasn't at all what Karl Marx was expecting. The Fabians were a little surprised that their brand and this whole philosophy that they were pushing wasn't catching on. And part of it was because they were talking about nationalizing an economy. And people weren't really responding because, as we've even seen as conservatives, talking about economics is sometimes challenging for a lot of people, right? It's complicated, there's a lot to explain. So people weren't really responding. So in essence, both of these groups had a branding problem, right? So they had to figure it out. So here we are, 1923. Marxism gets a little bit of a makeover. Who can't use a makeover, right? Even Marxism. So 1923, Marxists Karl Nuremberg and Felix Weil were busy at the Institute of Social Research in Germany, and they were trying to figure out how to implement socialism across Germany and then, of course, spread it to Europe, when Max Horkheimer took over. And Max Horkheimer renamed it the Frankfurt School for its location, and then he shifted the focus from one of direct economic intervention to a complete cultural transformation. And he had the bright idea of doing this by integrating the ideas of Karl Marx with Sigmund Freud. Okay? And he knew that if he could do that, if he could understand the psychology of the masses, that he could influence their thinking and he could change their ideas, and hence social change and cultural revolution would happen. And if you have cultural revolution, then you can replace values and morals and governmental systems with the ones that you want.
The solution, according to the Frankfurt School, was not just a political revolution to overthrow capitalism, but a social and cultural revolution as well.
Okay, so there you have it. So now in 1930, okay, we're still in Europe, armed with a new name and a vision. Horkheimer assembled his dream team, okay? Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, who's pictured here, and Erich Fromm. Now these are social psychologists, these are intellectuals, mostly German, okay? They're kind of like the all-star team of socialism, if you will. So he had them together to talk about how are they going to implement a social psychological revolution in order to replace governmental systems with the ones that they want. Their goal was to detach the culture from any moral anchors whatsoever. And this is written in their writing, believe me, it's there. So interestingly, this is Herbert Marcuse. And what you're going to see is a little clip of him, in his own words, reflecting back on that time. This is later in life, this interview, but reflecting back on 1930, when he and his comrades were developing this strategy of influencing people's psychology to put in the ideas that they wanted.
One of the most striking phenomena to see to what extent the ruling power structure could manipulate, manage, and control not only the consciousness, but also the subconscious and unconscious of the individuals. Therefore, at my friends at the Frankfurt School considered psychology one of the main branches of knowledge that had to be integrated with Marxian theory.
And there we have it, right? In his own words. None of this is coincidental that we just woke up one day in the 90s and there was this phrase political correctness and attacks on free speech and ideas of global citizenship, okay? None of it was for accident. This is the beginnings of a very specific strategy that was being formed. 1935, socialism comes to America. Now, how did that happen? Because interestingly, the Frankfurt School had this plan, as you just heard, and they might have just stayed there happily and tried to implement it in Germany and then across Europe. But World War II lent a hand in their fate. So as Hitler rose to power, the Frankfurt School packed their things up and they went via, I think they went via Austria for a while, but that didn't work. And they actually ended up in New York City at Columbia University. Aha! It's all making sense now. Right? Okay, so Columbia University, not surprisingly, as we know about our college system, welcomed them with open arms. They were fascinated by James and Ethel Rosenberg and Marxism and all of these kinds of intellectual, interesting, rebellious ideas. So the Frankfurt School actually found its home at Columbia University. They found a place to work, they were funded, and this is actually over the next 20 years where they ended up doing their most important work. And not only with Columbia University, but in concert with other intellectual elites throughout our educational system. Okay? The interesting thing is, even though now, yes, they had a place in America, they had a place to work, and really try and foment this system and perfect this system of influencing and changing the culture, right? But in America, people were not actually that unhappy with the current system. They liked capitalism, okay? It was working. It was spreading more wealth to more people than any other system in history, right? As we say, even if it's imperfect, it's the best imperfect thing we have. And people were willing to go with that. So for the next 20 years, Herbert Marcuse and his team worked on finding a surrogate for the middle class. They knew that they had to break up the middle class into specific victim groups that could then be targeted and turned. And again, this is all in their writing, it's all there. This is how the first plans for instilling a victim mentality came about. Okay, and we're still in 1935. Okay, we're not nearly to 1990 yet.
Rather than workers uniting and marching into battle, thus seizing power through force, they would make a long march through the institutions. Institutions like the arts, cinema, theater, literature, schools, college, seminaries, newspapers, magazines, and what is now known as radio, TV, and the mass media. Once this march is over, all the barriers to the acceptance of Marxism will have been quietly and systematically removed.
Okay, so there you have it, a march through the cultural institutions, social institutions, right? And there have been a lot of conversations since then, from then to now, of how our media, how our television, how our films influence political correctness and cultural norms and all kinds of social behaviors and lack of morals, right? This is a discussion that's been going on since this idea came out and is still continuing now. All right, so 1937, the Frankfurt School, continuing its work, thanks to Columbia and all those other wonderful universities, introduced something called critical theory. Now, Max Horkheimer described this theory as seeking to liberate human beings from the circumstances that enslave them. That sounds awful. Who wouldn't want to be liberated from those circumstances? This is in America. So their focus under the critical theory was to tear down Western values such as home is where the heart is, father knows best, and notions of family, God, and country, right? Those were the big things, right? What was the best job that a parent could hope their child grew up to be? President of the United States, right? That was something proud. That was something to be proud of. Okay, so those notions were to be torn down, tear down Western values and replace them with new values that divide, such as fathers are oppressive, God is dead, the founding fathers were rich white supremacists, and the current America was dominated by the establishment that must be taken down. These ideas were identified very specifically, as I say, and made a strategy of how to implement social change in the United States of America. There it is.
Critical theory. The term critical theory is something of a play on words. One is tempted to ask, what is the theory? The answer is the theory is to criticize. Through unremitting, destructive criticism of every institution of Western society, they hope to bring that society down.
Okay, sound familiar? Right? This is the essence of political correctness, right? Criticize completely the other side, criticize conservative values and ideas that oppose politically correct narratives, and bring those ideas down. Once you do that, then you can replace them with new ideas. And we know the list of all those new ideas. 1939, H.G. Wells, remember? Fabian Society? Well, they're still around, okay? So he comes out, he was a celebrity. He came out and he spoke about the New World Order, his thoughts about his vision for the future via the Fabian Society and what their work was working towards, what they were focusing on. And he says, this new and complete revolution we contemplate can be defined in a very few words. It's outright world socialism, scientifically planned and directed. Okay? One of the things about people who are proponents of social change and political correctness and even one world states is that they tend to always tell you what their plans are. Interestingly, there have been a lot of blinders on for whatever reason, right? But that's what he said. He also went on to say, there is no choice before mankind but a worldwide control of power and production. The supreme task before our awakened mind is the re-education of the world. And the Fabian Society was still working over in England to this end. Meanwhile, the Frankfurt School was working very diligently in the United States to this end. Okay? Then you also had Marxism and communism that had a similar vision of a one-world state. So there were a lot of parallel and compatible streams of thought that were coming together into one big pool, right, that would feed political correctness. Now, since the 20s, the Fabian Society had, like I said, been working in the shadows to do this. So Bernard Shaw mentioned H.G. Wells, other celebrities. So they were influential through this work over in England, actually, believe it or not, with the formation of the International Court of Justice at The Hague and the League of Nations. Did you know that? The Fabian Society was a huge advocate of the League of Nations. Because why? Of course, they want a one world government. Even if it's voluntary, it's better than no world government. Okay? So in 1945, that's an important year, because that's the year that the United Nations received their charter. And they officially replaced the League of Nations. So H.G. Wells came to the airwaves again, he took to the airwaves, and he had this to say about it.
30 years ago, to think of one super government throughout the world was an impossible dream. Now it is an imperative necessity.
Okay, could you understand him with his, he sounded like Glenn of the Good Witch from, right? 30 years ago. So 30 years ago, to think of one super government throughout the world was an impossible dream. Now it is an imperative necessity. You know, they're just salivating, the Fabians, at what's going on because they're making progress. They're checking the boxes. Now here we are back in America. Our attention to the Frankfurt School. What have they been up to? 1955, Herbert Marcuse writes a book that got a lot of attention called Eros and Civilization. Anybody heard of it? No? Okay, well you have now. Now you're ruined forever, now you've heard of it. It promoted something called a polymorphous perversity. And this was the beginning, mind you, remember, they're going to influence psychology and they're going to strip down the morals of American society, right? We already know that. So this zeroes in on the first of the victim groups, which would be women and sexual oppression.
Martin Jay confirms the role of the Frankfurt School in creating these victim groups that constitute the politically correct coalition.
But the working class wouldn't play the hegemonic role that traditional Marxism had expected from it. And so students, blacks, other minority groups, women, and so forth were, they hoped at least, able to come together.
Of critical importance for the injection of the Frankfurt School's work into the student rebellion of the 1960s was Marcuse's revival of Fromm's notion of sexual liberation.
Marcuse, however, was the main conduit of ideas. Marcuse had written one important work in the 1950s called Eros and Civilization, a work which attempted to rub Freud against the grain and come out with a radical and utopian reading of psychoanalysis.
Okay, so again, these are all very deliberate tactics, and not surprisingly, In the 1960s, what do we have? We have a sexual revolution. We all think, right? The people who were involved in the sexual revolution all think that this was organic, right? That this sprang from their subconscious. But mind you, there's been 30 years, 40 years of work to influence that subconscious mind, okay? Now, if Herbert Marcuse and the Frankfurt School were the architects of social engineering, Saul Alinsky is the hammer and nails, right? He helped make it workable. He's the field soldier. He's the one who created a professional community organizer. He created the 13 rules for radicals on how to agitate. He really took those victim groups and stirred up the hornet's nest, right? He agitated. He was an agitator. So he was a good foot soldier for the visions of the Frankfurt School. He set the tone for ruthlessness, and he really set a tone in our culture of, hey, the establishment, whoever they are, whoever's in power, and it's not you, they're bad, and they need to be torn down. That was where we started really radicalizing people's activism. Now, here we are in the 70s. Let's all have a happy moment in the 70s, because this is when Marcuse's dream really starts to be realized even more. Because after we get through the 60s, the 70s shows that categories of victimhood are now starting to gain acceptance. In the 60s, there was a lot of fighting back and forth about it, right? There was a lot of angst, there was a lot of agitation, there was a lot of protesting, and so forth. In the 70s, people accepted this as normal. You had the era of feminism, right? You had the sensitive man. You had Phil Donahue and Alan Alda. It's true. This was part of the culture, right?
And part of the economy, too.
Absolutely. So feminism was spurred on in the 70s also by the feminists Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon. They paved the way for this debate and really kept it alive throughout this decade. They wrote a lot about this. One of the things they wrote is that they saw men as threats of domination. They saw rape and marriage and prostitution as being equal. Okay, equally oppressive to women, and called it indistinguishable institutions and acts. Andrea Dworkin died in 2005, but she said heterosexual sex is an affront to women. McKinnon in 1989 published a book called Toward the Feminist Theory of the State. And see, this is very telling of where their minds are. It draws parallels between sexual oppression of women and the Marxist notions of a class struggle. So there's a lot of puzzle pieces being fit in together, and parallels being made of things that aren't parallel, right? Of women's oppression or women's issues and Marxism, okay, and statism. Now, in the 1980s, the emergence of Frank Marshall Davis and community organizers took even a new revamping, right? Frank Marshall Davis took it to the next level, right, after Alinsky. He's thought by many, right? He's an outright domestic terrorist. But he was also Uncle Frank to Barack Obama. Okay? The loving relationship between Uncle Frank and a young community organizer in Chicago. And they visualized a world made up of a classless society. And I say they, I mean, I have to say, to be accurate, Frank Marshall Davis. But hey, I mean, why wouldn't you be thinking and influenced and agreeing with your Uncle Frank, right? So Frank Marshall Davis visualized a world made up of a classless society, which is consistent with the Fabians and it's consistent with the Frankfurt School. It's all falling into line. And he said that his sole criterion was to wipe out white supremacy. So that is to accept the notion that there is, in 1980s, white supremacy, and then to set out to wipe it out. That is the highest goal that he had. So now the 90s come. Remember the Fabian tortoise? Well, now it strikes hard, because in the beginning of our talk, that was where we first heard the term politically correct, right? So that just shows you how far it's come from 1884, because now people say the words politically correct. And we go from victimhood, different victims, right? Whether it's race or by gender or by anything else that we can talk about, class, economic class, education. Now we go from just being a victim to obligation. Now you're obligated to start to believe these things. This isn't debate anymore. Critical theory is in play. You're not to debate this. This is what it is. And people are starting to talk in those terms in our culture. Not everyone, but a lot of people, right? Political correctness is becoming accepted. And the 90s is when the phase 2 comes in. Environmentalism and climate change is to be one of the major ways in which the new system will be ushered in as a subset of international requirements of how good citizens should behave. Okay? The concept of a global citizen is coming into our vocabulary in our minds because now we're starting to have an internet. We're talking about that. We're talking about what the internet will be like, and people are thinking more globally. Okay? And you don't have to take my word for it about the agenda behind environmentalism. Harvey Rubin, okay, he was the vice chair of the International Council on Local Environmental Initiatives. Okay, so first of all, why is there an international body sticking their nose in local initiatives? But okay, there it is. And he's the one who said, hey, look, individual rights will just have to take a backseat to the collective. Pure and simple. Because environmentalism is more important. And if you're a good global citizen, you will understand that, because now, not only do you have to relate, you have to sympathize with victims, but you are obliged to believe this stuff and conform. Now we move into the 2000s. We have liberating tolerance. Herbert Marcuse is still defining the narrative to this day in the 2000s, all the way back from the 1930s. We move from obligation to compliance. So it's not only that you have to now believe this stuff, you must change your behavior and conform, right? You must recycle. You must do these things that we say. Reuse, reuse, recycle, right? And I'm not saying that's bad on the surface in and of itself, right? But each little thing is a death by 1,000 cuts. And this is where obligation becomes the expectation of compliance. They also move in the 2000s, our culture moves from compliance to loyalty. At some point, it's not even enough that you're complying. You need to believe it. You need to embrace it like a religion. This is part of who we are as good people. How can you not believe that? How can you not think that? There's something wrong with you. You're a bad person. And then we move in phase 3 from loyalty to activism. This is where, okay, look, you believe it, you embrace it, you're complying, but that's not enough. Like a good citizen, you need to go out and you need to shut down people who aren't supporting this. And you need to get your friends to be doing this. You need to be active. That's where we come in the 2000s. And Herbert Marcuse and his team at the Frankfurt School were very excellent engineers at this.
And tolerance for the ideas from the left.
All right, sound familiar? Okay, cover your eyes if you have small children in the room. 2008, arguably our most historical election in the country, and a Forbes.com contributor named Jerry Bauer wrote an article called Barack Obama, Fabian Socialist. Fabian, what's that about? Oh, I don't know, right? Well, now you know what it's about. There's a lot that it's about. And what's really fascinating about this article, and the reason I put it up here for this talk, is because it's so fascinating to me to read what he predicts in 2008, sitting here now in 2015. So let's take a look. He says, so here's the playbook. Here's what's going to happen with this administration. The left will identify, freeze, personalize, and polarize an industry such as healthcare, education, energy, or the police force. It will attempt to nationalize 1/5 of the U.S. economy through legislative action or executive order. And industry won't be nationalized in one fell swoop. Now think of the Frankfurt School and think of even Marxism. Think of the Fabians. He says an industry won't be nationalized in one fell swoop. Instead, a parallel system will be created with the old system forced to subsidize the new one. Now there's a system I can think of right now where that is happening. Energy. Right? Because climate change and green energy is a parallel system running side by side with our traditional energy, coal, right, and oil. And now coal and oil industries are forced through executive action to subsidize, to pay high taxes or fees or something, I don't know what it is, but they have to subsidize the green industry. Okay, so this is happening. Really, really scary. It raises the hair on my arms to see how he predicted that. So the Fabian MO, he goes on to write, is relentless journalistic and cultural attacks on everything that is, and then a hard pitch for the hope of what might be. And in 2008, in a campaign speech, it cuts out a little bit, but you know what she's saying is Barack, okay? Michelle Obama gave us a good vision of what is to come. Oh, well, in a second, hang on. I forgot about this. In concert with pop culture outlets like The Daily Show and SNL, Obama will use his podium to humiliate and demonize those of us who don't want to come together and heal the planet. Right? Because then what are you now today if you don't want to come together and heal the planet? Climate change denier. Right? You're a denier. There's no debating. Okay? You do not have an opinion that counts here. And that's why. So let's hear what Michelle Obama said in 2008 in a campaign speech.
And Barack Obama will require you to work. He is going to demand that you shed your cynicism, that you put down your division, that you come out of your isolation, that you move out of your comfort zones, that you push yourself be better, and that you engage, but will never allow you to go back to your lives as usual.
Boy, wasn't that the truth? I mean, when I hear that, I can just picture Marx, Karl Marx, or some communist person saying that, you know, and everybody like standing in these March gray uniforms or something in the Soviet Union. March 8th, 2012. So as Barack Obama is rounding out his first term, interestingly enough, he starts to gain a little bit of, energy for signing some bills and passing things. So he signs a bill expanding the power of the Secret Service to restrict speech and make arrests based on speech. Okay, and there's a lot more to it, obviously. There's a whole article about it, and you can read about the bill. But I found it interesting because, you know, sometimes different people, enemies, make strange bedfellows, and it was the ACLU in Washington who said, hey, that is going way too far. And I just thought, really? Okay, well, hey, I'm with you. I mean, I get it. But I was surprised, because it's got to be pretty bad when the ACLU is criticizing Barack Obama. But there it is. All right, so moving along. That just gives us a little reminder of Voltaire, right? The French philosopher and writer who said to find out who rules over you, simply find out who you are not allowed to criticize. And I think, you know, I have a 7 and a 9-year-old, and I know they're a little young for history like this, but not too many of our young adults today think about that, because they're busy doing it. They're busy doing it, they're busy aiding and abetting it, and enabling it. So it's a little bit scary. Now, speaking of children and youth, now we really start to come into the whole thing, okay? Because political correctness has invaded the culture. They have gotten under the skin of the psyche of Americans. They've been successful. Now you have to focus on the future. You have to focus on children, right? And it's change, you better believe. I know everybody in here does. But let's go back, because they always tell us what they're going to do. Karl Marx said in his Communist Manifesto, the education of all children, as soon as they can get along without a mother's care, shall be in state institutions at the expense of the state. And Hillary Clinton comes along in the 90s and says, oh, it takes a village. Just precious. Okay, well, she learned from Alinsky, and she knows her history. Right? She knows her history. Lenin said, give me 4 years to teach the children, and the seed I have sown will never be uprooted. And then Jane Robbins is someone we've never heard of. I hadn't heard of her either, and that's okay, but she is a retired AP US history teacher, and she, for a time, sat on an AP education board to try and do some good. And she came out of it shaking her head and throwing up her arms, and she said, you know what? These AP exams, rather than a belief that America has a mission to spread democracy and new technologies, this framework teaches that it was built on a belief in white racial superiority and a sense of American cultural superiority. Okay? The indoctrination of our schools, our children, our curriculum, and their minds, it was well underway and is underway. There's a film called Indoctrinate You. If you have, isn't it good?
Great,
It's so good. Everybody should watch it. It's by Evan Coyne Maloney. You're not Evan Coyne Maloney, are you?
I'm not.
It'd be cool if you were. Oh, okay, that's smart.
He's taller than me, though.
Okay, I don't know what you listen. But anyway, it's an awesome film. It's by Evan Coyne Maloney. You can get it on YouTube. You can look at it for free. But in there, he talks about the degree to which political correctness and attacks on free speech have invaded our campuses, and we know this. It's fresh in our minds from this week, right? fresh in our minds from this weekend, worse than ever. So this guy here, Professor David Clemens at Monterey Peninsula College, is talking about a form that all professors have to fill out if they want to start a new course at the university. And it says, the instructions are, include a description of how course topics are treated to develop an understanding of race, class, and gender issues. Now, some people might say, well, what's wrong with that? But we're talking about, and he says in the film, every course. If it's horticulture, you have to talk about how horticulture can develop an understanding of race, class, and gender issues. If it's history, you'd better take it from this angle. And if it's math, you have to find a way to incorporate race, class, and gender issues into math. So here's what David Clemens says about what's happening on the campuses.
If you can get students persuaded of a couple of basic ideas about the nature of reality, you can go a long way toward succeeding in a social engineering project to get you engaged.
Yeah, big sad face. Absolutely. So here we are now, okay? We're wrapping it up, don't worry. But here we are. Our college campuses, if you haven't been to one lately, you should go. You should go have a walk around. Okay, but you white guys, don't go alone. Just saying. I'm not politically correct, everybody knows that. Okay, so on our campuses, trigger warnings, do we all know what those are? That's if something is about to be written. Usually it's written, but maybe public, demonstrated. There's a sign that says trigger warning because what you're about to see might be so disturbing to you that it triggers some horrible psychological reaction in you. At which point, I'm dead serious, at which point you might need to go to a safe space, which are also on campuses. And if you ever feel so threatened by, you know, a Christian demonstration or something like that that just offends your sensibilities to such an extent that you can't handle it, there are safe spaces on college campuses with psychologists and social worker type people standing by to help you. And they have free speech zones. And those free speech zones, mind you, the entire United States of America is a free speech zone, hello. But they don't know that on college campuses because these are little Ivy League Soviet unions. Okay, that's what they are. So they created free speech zones on college campuses, but they're anything but, because the kind of free speech you can have in there without being bullied and absolutely, completely, and utterly like shut down is only politically correct free speech. So there's tons and tons of headlines that we could go through of all the ways that political correctness has invaded our culture and our society today, right? Children in elementary school were asked to remove parts of the Bill of Rights and talk about how that would improve the Bill of Rights. School dance Christmas trees, colors red and green. Denver area students accused the school board of censoring U.S. history because indeed they were. I'm glad at least the students said something. That was kind of a nice flip. University students were asked to sign a pledge to use inclusive language. To sign a pledge saying you're going to speak this way, sign here. And you're not going to speak that way in America. The PC police start going after our culture, our theater, our books. This is where censorship starts to come into play. They want to shut that down. They don't like the producers, they're offended, they want to shut it down. Free speech is under attack. Of course, we know Charlie Hebdo, and sadly to say this morning, that story is already sadly and sorely outdated, right? But it's attacks on free speech, it's attacks on our way of life. Now, if you think all that is hard to believe, think about this. From 1990 to now, for the first time in our country, we have an entire generation of young adults who, from the time they went to kindergarten until they graduated college and are now in their first jobs, have only ever known an America like this. Wow. Think about that. No wonder. No wonder. Now, there's a funny way to look at it. I'm going to give you a little bit of a break, but it does still make the point.
Yeah, college kids now are so politically correct. I mean, to the point where, I'll give you an example. We had interns at the show, sure. Like the last year of the show with the interns, and said, "This one, I'm getting lunch. What do you want?" I said, "I don't know. Where are you going?" He said, "We get Mexican." I said, I don't really like Mexican. He goes, whoa, that's kind of racist. No, Anthony Walker always does not racist. You have no idea what racism is. That's not racist, you idiot, you moron.
That's where we are. That's where we are, folks. What can I tell you? Political correctness is defining everything we can say in public and also in private. How many stories do we know now of corporate company owners, of basketball game coaches, who have private conversations, good or bad, like them or not, they're private conversations, who are completely ostracized, their lives are destroyed because of what they said. Just because of what they said. There are unacceptable words in our society now, and there are way more than the ones here, but you know, you can't say mortgage anymore, because that denotes home ownership, and that's bad. You can't say management, because that denotes having power over another. You can't say boy or girl or gender or sex, because that also divides people and offends people who don't know that they're a boy or a girl or a human being on earth. And so these words are bad, they're taboo, and we have to replace the words because, again, that's been part of the plan. I hope you see all the pieces of the puzzle fitting together on this journey. Replacing is part of the plan. You can't say Columbus Day, but you can say Explorers Day. Did you know that you can't say pet owner? Wow. You're a pet guardian. It's wrong to own another creature, don't you know that? You can't say Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. You can't say we're keeping you in our prayers. You have to say we're keeping you in our thoughts, right? Just in case, God forbid, you offend someone. Okay, so here we are, back at the convention center, back in this room in the present day. We've taken a journey from 1884 to now. I hope, again, like I said, that you've seen the pieces of the puzzle fitting together. That this has been very deliberate. And I want to leave you with an unlikely messenger who has some parting words, and an Irish rock star named Bono. Anybody know Bono? Yeah. Good. That was an important question. Okay. I'm going to leave you with his words.
Anyway, it's not a right-left issue. It's a right-wrong issue. And America has constantly been on the side of what's right. Because when it comes down to it, this is like keeping faith with the idea of America. Because America's an idea, isn't it? I mean, Ireland's a great country, but it's not an idea. Great Britain's a great country. It's not an idea. That's how we see you around the world, as one of the greatest ideas in human history, right up there with the Renaissance, right up there with the crop rotation of the Beatles' White Album. The idea, the American idea, it's an idea. The idea is that you and me are created equal. It will ensure that an economic recession need not become an equality recession. The idea that life is not meant to be endured but enjoyed. The idea that if we have dignity, if we have justice, then leave it to us, we'll do the rest. This country was the first to claw its way out of darkness and put that on paper. And God love you for it, because these aren't just American ideas anymore. There's no copyright on them. You brought them into the world. It's a wide world now. I know Americans say they have a bit of the world in them, and you do. The family tree has lots of branches. But the thing is, the world has a bit of America in it too. These truths, your truths, they're self-evident in us.
Amen. Say that.